Okay, we're live. Thanks everyone for joining. I'll let people filter in here. And hopefully, but we'll get started with the intros because there's not a ton to miss here. So this is our update on testing and cannabis and hemp. Vicente, and we're joined by Josh Werzer from SC Labs, the founder and co-founder and chief compliance officer. So go to next slide. That's a little bit about the firm, so it's not that important for people that are filtering in. And of course, I should mention, I'll say this again. We send slides around after these presentations, as well as this will be on YouTube. So if you have to jump, you'll have this, and so you don't have to take careful notes. You can just kind of refer back to this. So this is a bit about SC Labs, and I'll let Josh say something about SC Labs if you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, I'll keep it brief, but yeah, we're founded in 2010. I think we're the oldest running cannabis testing laboratory in the country, and so we still, I think, to this date, most of our existence was before any type of state regulations or anything like that. So in the early days, we operated sort of as just a voluntary testing laboratory for people at that time the medical marijuana industry who were interested in doing testing, and then as we've legalized across the country, we've joined that as well, and so it kind of shifted the paradigm, and so now we're testing in 5 states.
That's great. Okay, next slide. So these are the individuals on today's call. So I'll just let everyone say a little bit about themselves. So I guess we'll go with the Andrew. You want to go first?
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. So my name's Andrew Livingston. I'm the director of economics and research at Vicente, at the law firm, helping clients really across the country and a little bit across the world navigate the patchwork of different state cannabis laws. I've helped people build some pro formas for testing labs and do testing lab analysis. And a number of years ago, probably about 6 or so years ago, did a large testing analysis and policy and economics report for what was then National Cannabis Industry Association's Policy Council. So I've got some in-depth knowledge on the testing side of things. I'll be talking about some of the economic drivers in the market.
Casey?
I'm Casey Lever. I'm a director of regulatory compliance for Vicente. Me and Jen both cover regulatory compliance, including how labs operate within different cannabis regulatory schemes. I cover East Coast, and Jen covering the West. So Jen, I don't know if you want to add anything else there.
No, that about sums it up. Thanks for the introduction.
And Michelle?
Hi, Michelle Bodian. I'm partner here at the law firm as well. I'm a co-chair of the hemp and cannabinoid department. So all fun things, hemp, cultivation, finished product, distillate, as well as on the cannabis side, helped a number of labs obtain their licenses in a number of markets.
And just say a bit. So Charlie Alvacetti, I run the corporate group here at Vicente, and I don't really deal with anything specific to cannabis compliance or testing, other than there are some unique ownership requirements with respect to labs that vary state by state, but they're all kind of in the same vein, which is sort of my kind of role that I've played with testing labs. So I guess we could go ahead to the next slide. We'll start with a conversation with Josh. So I thought that, and just for everyone's sake who's watching this, if you have any questions, just please type it in the chat. We'll try and get to it at the end. Just be aware that none of us are PhDs. So, difficult scientific or technical questions, if Josh can't answer it, I suspect no one on this call will be able to answer it. Obviously, we're more on the compliance side. So I just want to kick things off, just kind of talking to Josh a little bit about his experience in testing and what's going on in testing right now. So Josh, I guess, could you just share a little bit more about your background?
Sure. So I'm a co-founder, so I've been with the lab since the beginning. Before that, I was actually the laboratory director for Steep Hill Labs, which was the first laboratory in the country to do this type of testing. So started there, came over from Samsung, where I was doing research and development for electronic materials. So kind of completely different avenue. Sort of took that job interview on a whim, saw the posting and said something about medical marijuana at the end. And at the time, there were no laboratories in existence. And, I filled out a CV and I just so I could get an interview and see what the heck they were up to. Went in there and they were about to open and they needed a lab director and offered me the job. I was kind of ready to move on to something new and figured I'd take the job until I found a real job. And of course, never put it on my resume because it'd be a career killer. 14, 15 years later, it's what I'm doing. So I've sort of been with the industry since its inception at the testing portion of it. So I'm probably not the greatest scientist in the industry, but I'm been here since the beginning. And so I've got a long arc. And so I've seen it all go down, and sort of with the laboratory, it's been really, kind of a privilege to have sort of a really cool vantage point to watch this industry develop and grow and get to interact with, so many people with the lab. You're not sort of just focused on your company, you're helping everyone else. And so it's been really, really fun to just watch the industry evolve, watch people come in with, an idea, maybe a prototype, and see them blow up to, the biggest edible maker in the country or whatever. And so it's been, a really interesting journey. And so now I've served as president for the first 10 years we were in existence. And then I served as the chief operating officer for about a year and a half. And now I'm the chief compliance officer. So I oversee compliance, QA, research and development, and for some reason, marketing. So I'm slowly trying to get less and less responsibility, but so that's what I'm doing these days.
All right. Well, I'm going to try and narrow the question a little bit, because if I asked you about like your view of the cannabis industry from inception, there's a lot of, it's been a while at this point. So in terms of just facing forward, sort of what's kind of your long view of cannabis testing and the cannabis industry?
Yeah, and so we're I'm sure we're going to touch on it, quite a bit here, but so bringing with legalization and sort of regulations of laboratories and sort of the compulsory testing in sort of all the markets that have legalized. There was a big change. Like I said early on, it was people coming in who were interested in getting the testing, maybe saw it as a value add to their customers, or they knew that they had very clean product and they wanted to be able to highlight that and improve that to their customers. So it was sort of a more innocent time back then, with regulations in required testing and such strict tolerances for contaminants, and then certainly the kind of marketing potential of THC percentages being listed on every label. It's gotten much more complex. There's sort of a lot of incentive for brands to be able to show that they have THC or high THC percentages in the inhalable products. So that's led to a lot of issues with THC inflation and all of that we've sort of dealt with from the beginning. But we've seen it sort of accelerate recently, and so that's sort of been in the testing world, kind of the big issue is, and it's different in different markets. But how do we maintain sort of the credibility of this really cool quality control regime we've built? The cannabis plant, and rightfully so, since it's inhaled and not ingested, any type of contaminants go directly into your lungs, directly into your bloodstream. And so it's much more important that cannabis, is free from some of these contaminants than, say, a chocolate bar, because we're burning it. We don't know what kind of byproducts come from that. And we don't know what a lot of these like pesticides or processing chemicals, residual solvents, things like that do when they're inhaled directly into your lungs. We have a lot of data on ingesting some of these pesticides and ingesting some of these contaminants, but there still isn't a lot of epidemiological data on exactly how these contaminants affect us when inhaled. So it's really cool that cannabis is sort of an example to the food industry, to the environmental testing industry, to the nutraceutical industry. But also we're sort of dealing with, how do we police the labs who are sort of put in this gatekeeper position? How do we police the industry and make sure that we continue to kind of uphold the consumer safety, and then also too, sort of the nature of how cannabis is bought and sold both on a wholesale level and then at the consumer level has changed a lot. It used to be, buyers at dispensaries were opening up a turkey bag, giving it a smell, and sort of qualitatively assessing the cannabis. Now a lot of this is done on a spreadsheet, and then at the dispensary, the consumers aren't, opening, looking at a jar full of nugs and giving it a smell and really inspecting the cannabis and making their decision on what smells the best and what presumably would taste the best. They're making those decisions based on kind of the label. And so that one value, that THC value, which I would argue, really doesn't give you any indication of the quality of the cannabis, has become so important that it's really driven sort of, kind of a lot of these decisions. And as such, that applies a huge pressure on everyone to be able to put a high number on that label. And so, we've seen over the last year in California, it's always been a huge issue in Oregon. Last year in California, it's really accelerated. It's going to happen in other markets. It's already happening to a certain degree in most markets. And so that's one of the things we've really been dealing with a lot. And then also, as time has gone on kind of the upside of that, we've also seen kind of better standardization of the laboratories. In general, there's a lot more kind of scientific literature out there on how to do this testing properly. On one hand, you've seen sort of an improvement in the ability for labs to do a good job, but then you've also seen this sort of incentive for them to maybe not always do a great job.
So yeah, I just want to focus on that because it sounds like, we'll talk about this later in the presentation as well, but it sounds like potency inflation is like one of the major trends right now. It's a major issue in cannabis testing. So you said, in your view, I guess in your experience, this is something that's accelerated, it's always been present, but it's accelerated recently.
Yeah. I mean, California, I'll use just as an example. And it seems like in a lot of ways, as these markets mature, they follow kind of a similar arc. And so California is just there. Like I said, Oregon's always been an issue. Oregon, you've always seen sort of everything on the shelf, or most of the stuff on the shelf was, the THC values were inflated 20, 30, 40%. In California, you had sort of certain people that were doing it. You had certain laboratories that were playing along. And it's always been an issue, but it sort of hit a critical mass where buyers aren't even buying cannabis now unless it tests over 26 or 28% THC. If you grow a crop and you get a test result lower than that, you're either going to have to turn it into, extract it and turn it into oil or, whatever. You're not going to be able to sell it as flour. So what that's done is it's made everyone play along. So where it was just a few producers doing it previously, it's to the point where if you want to stay in business and you're a cannabis grower, you need that number. And so you're going to go somewhere that'll give it to you. And so it's to the point where almost everyone is doing it. We just did a study recently with two other laboratories that, trying to figure out a way to get us out of it, that where we were pulling samples from the shelf, and every single sample we pulled from the shelf was inflated at least 30%. I mean, if cannabis flowers haven't suddenly over the last year jumped from, an average of maybe 25% to an average of 35, 40% in THC. It's all artificial. And so, that's kind of created this point where we need someone to step in and help it. The producers and growers can't do anything about it because they need to stay in business. So, the state and the regulators have been slow to act. And I think for a number of reasons, not all of which are their fault, but yeah, it's become a really big issue over the last year, I would say.
I guess from a consumer standpoint, like, is there anything consumers can do?
Yeah, stop buying cannabis based on THC percentage.
Yeah.
I mean, we've promoted sort of the terpene content, like, and it's the old, we've been saying it since the beginning. I'm sure everyone's heard the analogy that you don't buy wine on alcohol content. And cannabis is the same way. When you inhale cannabis, you exhale like 96% of the cannabinoids back out. So you could just hold the cannabis in a little bit longer. If you had a 14% cannabis strain or a 28% cannabis strain, you could just hold that 14% cannabis strain in, a few seconds longer, and you get the same effect. But for me, when I'm smoking cannabis flower or a concentrate, I'm interested in the flavor, the aroma, maybe the unique effects from the different terpenes that are in there. And and that's what really indicates quality cannabis. So get the producers testing terpenes, get the consumers educated to it. Have the consumers hopefully be able to, at the point of sale, smell a sample of that cannabis strain, and really start teaching the consumer to make decisions based on what really makes cannabis quality. And I think that's sort of the laboratory's fault. Like I said, I've been in this since the beginning, and really early on, you saw a ton of strains that were kind of staple strains back in the day that tested 14, 15, 16%. I'm talking like Bubba Kush, the purple strains. A lot of those types of strains were only 14, 15%, but they're really flavorful. They had really cool effects, and people love them. But as soon as you put that number on the package, now people are like, well, why would I get a 14% strain when I can go get a 25%, sour diesel or something like that? And so, to an extent, it's our own fault for doing this. But yeah, I think hopefully over time, consumers will kind of evolve to understand that that's not really what's important. It's just something on the label, and it's probably less important than alcohol, since you're not really ingesting all of what you're inhaling.
Interesting. Yeah, I was going to say that it almost reminds me of what they say would happen with the wine industry with Wine Spectator and scoring, where you start, someone comes out with an influential scoring system, which I guess is a little different than THC percentages, and everyone gets kind of fixated on that number, and then everyone sort of adjusts their behavior to increase their number.
Yeah.
I guess
just like, Rotten Tomatoes for movies, it's gotten to the point where we see that rating or we see that number and we don't want to look past that. And you miss a lot of really cool things that would appeal to you that maybe just didn't appeal to whoever put that number on whatever it is.
I guess. And so in terms of like the differences between markets, from testing and potency inflation, is this have to do with how long the market's, how mature the market is?
Yeah.
You think it's,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to, or do you think it's another factor?
It seems to me, just having observed this in several markets, it's a number of things. I think, it's the engagement of the regulators. It's how quick they are to sort of, kind of put a clamp down on it with the laboratories, how engaged they are with the laboratories, whether or not they're pulling samples from the shelf and double checking some of this stuff. So that's a big part of it. But also it seems that, as early on in these markets, and it kind of follows with the production kind of cycle. It seems like early on in these markets, it's all green skies. We're ramping up production. There's more demand than there is supply. And so everyone's making money, and there's less incentive to sort of, for lack of a better word, cheat. And as kind of sort of the markets mature, production sort of outpaces demand, wholesale prices drop, people get desperate, and they're looking for any way to sort of make that money on their pounds. And when you have wholesale prices that start to become attached to the THC percentage, and you sort of have these these gates like you have in California, where it's sort of like a rule now where no buyer is going to buy anything under 26%. I've heard it's sort of creeping up to 28% now. Then you have to play along. So it's a combination of factors, but it seems to happen as the markets get more mature and sort of in lockstep with kind of that supply demand, that overproduction point where most markets at some point.
And I guess just to shift gears a little bit, talk about earlier and stuff, we're talking about consumer safety. On the consumer safety side, like, what do you think I guess, any sort of recent trends or changes that you would highlight?
Yeah. Oh, and it's sort of kind of along the same lines, but what we've seen early on when a lot of these states regulated, you had a bunch of new labs in the business. And like I said, there wasn't very much literature out there on how to do a lot of these tests properly in cannabis. A pesticide test in strawberries is very different from pesticide tests in cannabis, because cannabis is so oily and resinous. It creates a lot of background noise that makes it difficult to find these pesticides at really low levels. Whereas with strawberries, they're mostly water, which is clean. It doesn't really, kind of create that, we call it a matrix effect, but it's basically just noise in the background that kind of makes it hard to see that signal in amongst the noise. And so, There wasn't a lot of information out there. These labs had mostly developed these methods from start. If I'm going to test pesticides in strawberries, I go pull out the AOAC official methods of analysis, and it's sort of like a recipe book where I can list 10 different ways that I can test those pesticides in strawberries that have already been vetted, that have already been validated, and I couldn't do that in cannabis. So early on, we saw sort of a lot of bad testing, just because there wasn't a lot of standardization or a lot of reference for people to go to do this testing. And so that's improved a lot. So the labs in general, I think in most markets are doing a lot better job of contaminant testing, which is good. But then when you have sort of this potency inflation and you sort of cross that Rubicon or whatever, you sort of make that jump where, okay, well, I'm going to start giving people the cannabinoid percentages they want. It's not too much further of a road to go to say, well, all right, I'll make sure you never see aspergillus in your sample. And so we're seeing that too, not to the degree we're seeing it in, with potency inflation, but that's become an issue too, where you'll talk to customers and they say, no, I have an aspergillus problem and it's too expensive for me I just can't have an aspergillus fail. So I'm going with this lab. They tell me to microwave my sample before, and that way it kills everything and I won't see it. I mean, we will get samples and there's a certain labs where, or certain states like Colorado where we don't go and do the sampling ourselves. The people just send it in to us, and you'll see samples come in from micro testing that have clearly been dipped in bleach or microwaved. And like I said, I've talked to producers who say, yeah, my lab told me to microwave my sample before I come and pick it up, and then I come and they just hand me that sample on the side. So I mean, there's funny business like that going on. Again, I don't think it's the same, to the same extent that we're seeing with potency inflation, but it's also an issue. So, again, it's just kind of this thing where it's this kind of cat and mouse game where regulators need to be engaged. They need to be, making sure this stuff doesn't happen. They need to be pulling samples randomly from shelves and holding people accountable.
Yeah, no, it sounds like a lot of this is kind of downstream of the economic situation of cannabis.
Yep.
Just forcing people to effectively cut corners.
Yep.
I guess, before we move on to kind of the slides, I mean, I guess, is there, what's your view on sort of hygiene, industrial hygiene and strategies for prevention for cannabis companies? Are there any sort of things you'd highlight there?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the ways that we get out of this, is sort of having these cannabis companies become more like, a nutraceutical company, more like the pharmaceutical industry, where they have much more responsibility for their hygiene. I think we were talking before we started this about HACCP and starting to see some of these, these programs that those industries follow, where the producers have to be much more engaged with sort of their overall quality control, where it's not just as simple as, hey, I send it off to the lab. If it passes, I'm good to go. With HACCP or GMPs, you have to take a much more holistic approach as a producer to every step of the process. You have to be analyzing every step of the process. You have to be testing your inputs. You have to be testing your facilities. You have to ensure that you're creating this safe environment. So by the time you produce a product, it's almost guaranteed to be clean because you've already checked all the stuff beforehand upstream. And I think as the industry moves that way and sort of, grows up for a little bit more, and it's been an evolution, and certainly we've come a long ways. You'll see that kind of fix some of these issues, and I think you also have a situation where consumers can just feel a lot safer about what they're ingesting. I think we've already got one of the safest products out there, but there's definitely a lot of room for improvement still.
Great, thanks a lot, Josh. So as we go through the slides, if you see anything like that, just for the group, feel free to hop in here as we go through these slides. So if we go to the next one, so we'll go through these real quick, but this is just, probably remedial for everyone who's on this, but these are just different types of testing that we see. Next question, next slide. Why does it matter? Next slide. These are the challenges we're talking about here. Next slide. All right, so economics of the lab. So I turn to Andrew here, who's our, we call him our house economist, just to talk a little bit about what we were just discussing, right? Which is to what extent are the challenges in testing are sort of a downstream of economics.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie, and thanks, Josh, for the interesting conversation. So, I would say traditionally, right, in a well-regulated lab environment, you're competing on, really three primary factors, which is one, turnaround time or the efficiency of your testing. Two, you're competing on price, who can do this at um, the most price effective for those who are required testing. And three is just customer service, which is how well you treat your customers, how easy it is to get samples to the lab, conversations back and forth, how easy it is to get your test results back, in addition to the speed you get them back. And at that point, really, economies of scale as well as good business practices are able to help you, streamline all three of those. You can be faster in turnaround time, you can be more effective and efficient on prices, and with the right standard operating procedures and right, employees, you can also be really good on customer service. But when we deal with a situation where we don't have as well regulated of a lab environment, you suddenly start competing on the results of the lab itself, which again should be an objective measurement rather than a subjective measurement, as that's the whole purpose of lab testing in the first place. And that kind of creates a situation in which what you end up competing upon is the lack of scruples as a competitive edge. This isn't good for the lab environment generally, and it's something that we need to figure out how to tamper down by working directly by essentially the well-regulated labs as well as really consumer groups, because consumers groups and consumers themselves shouldn't like being lied to, right? Of course, there's obviously a placebo effect when it comes to cannabis of a certain extent, but you shouldn't be paying an extra 30% for cannabis that's an extra 30% THC when it's not actually any more potent. And in that way, it's really consumers who are getting the short end of the stick there. So consumer groups, legitimate labs need to be working with the regulators to find ways to tamp down on this, whether or not it's round robin testing and increasing the frequency of round robin testing, whether or not it's essentially samples being pulled off the shelves randomly and being tested, and fines and or other punitive measures for the testing facilities that are significantly off on those tests. And as well, then really consumer education around kind of, as we mentioned, the myopic focus on THC, right? If you want to get the most high, just smoke more weed or smoke concentrates, right? But really what we also know nowadays is that your high is modulated by the terpenes. And so if you want to get the best high, it's about finding that terpene profile with the right amount of THC and potentially CBD, other cannabinoids, that works well with your psyche. So next slide. The other major things we need to think about kind of outside of the problematic competitive edge in a not as well regulated testing environment is kind of what other factors influence testing. And really there it is the frequency of testing. So you got, well, if you've got any questions, you can reach out to the firm. We do a lot of analysis on what type of testing is required, as well as what the frequency of that testing throughout the supply chain. And the frequency of that testing is important, both when it comes to the number of different tests required, but also whether or not it's correlated with the size of the market as it comes to batch determination. So, if producers can determine their own batch sizes, you may end up having a situation where there's as the businesses get larger, they're able to then create larger batches, and the frequency of testing is not directly correlated to the volume of product produced and sold. Whereas if batch sizes, let's say for flower, are capped at 5 or 10 pounds, regardless of how big those businesses get, the frequency of that testing is always going to be linearly correlated with the volume cannabis produced and sold. Furthermore, there are some states, Colorado, and Genevieve can talk about this further, that with kind of process validation and they're changing the name of some of this, you're able to reduce the frequency of some of your required testing, as long as you show that you are, as a testing lab, as a producer, meeting those tests, and passing them in a certain level of frequency. Next slide. As we were mentioning, inflated potency has become a major problem in this industry, and this is really one of the things we wanted to talk about today. It is time, and is really honestly well past the time for the cannabis community, as I mentioned, both operators and consumers, to find ways around this, what is clearly an inaccurate representation of the products people are consuming. Slide. And I'll let Charlie chat about corporate.
All right. Okay. So this is my kind of limited contribution to the education today, which is, what specific rules govern. So we'll talk about this in the next slide, but essentially, cannabis license includes a testing license in most states. So what does that mean? Well, if you hold a cannabis license in a state, you're going to be subject to background checks, disclosure obligations, renewal, suspension, penalties. So even though you're just a testing lab, we might view just you're still part of this regime here of cannabis ownership, which creates some nuances around corporate issues, right? So one big one is in some the level of isolation from the other parts of the value chain will depend on the state. So if you look at the first tab, this is from New York. So like I saw there's some chatter about New York in the Q&A, which by the way, I'll get to the Q&A at the end as we have questions, but New York has this incredibly broadly based rule in terms of what a cannabis testing license owner or owners can have in terms of interests in New York. So essentially, if you own part of a cannabis license in New York, you couldn't even be a landlord to a non-testing license or lend them money. Whereas contrast that with Florida, which is called like a more lightly regulated state, you just can't own or control MMTC, which is the sort of full vertical license down there, can't own or control a testing lab. So it's something you should check on. Next slide. Yeah, so this is I probably should have had this one go first. But one thing I want to point out here is that if you're raising capital as a testing license, or if you're looking to invest as an investor in the cannabis industry, testing licenses are a little bit different. They're almost somewhat siloed from the rest of the industry because of this requirement. So, you're going to have to approach a different group of investors if you're raising capital. And if you're an investor, if you want to invest in the cannabis industry, you have no other investments in cannabis, you want to consider, hey, maybe I want to just play in the testing space. And not touch the other side of the equation, because once you're in the other side of the equation, there are states where you may not be able to invest. Next slide. Yeah, so this another issue, but in new states, often the initial focus is not on testing licenses. Look New York, right? What's been hitting the headlines? It's dispensaries, right? Because that's where customers are going to interact with the market. That's what's visible. But at the same time, if you want consumer safety, labs are a pretty critical component. And if you've only got a limited number of labs, like Connecticut, for example, with only one lab, it can make an effective regulated marketplace challenging. Not to mention the full, not all labs have all capacity. Josh, if you want to say something.
Oh, no.
You're just coming back on. Okay, sorry. Next slide. All right. So, is this Casey? Is this one you and Michelle? Oh, sorry, you and Jen.
I think I put these ones in here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And we talked about this a lot, so
yeah.
I'll just kind of I'll breeze through this. But yeah, I mean, and again, I think one of these bullet points here is sort of, I think the hemp industry has played a lot into this as well. So we've seen with the hemp industry that the hemp industry has shifted from predominantly producing CBD and sort of non-intoxicating cannabinoids to now we see a lot of intoxicating cannabinoids in hemp. They're predominantly produced through synthetic means, from taking CBD, basically synthesizing CBD into other compounds that are similar to THC or directly into delta-9, and that sort of also applied pressure to the cannabis industry. So you have a lot of these cannabinoids that they're like THC, but they're not THC. They maybe have greater binding affinities. They're much stronger, and so and again, they're completely sort of we have no research on them. We don't know how safe they are. We don't know what kind of contaminants from that synthetic process. Well, we have an idea of some of the contaminants, but we don't know all the contaminants that show up when these different synthetic processes take place and what those can do to people. And now we're starting to see some of those synthetic cannabinoids, since they're so much cheaper to produce, showing up in the regulated space, where regulators will take, cannabinoids extracted from cannabis, add a bunch of these synthetic cannabinoids to it. Now they have more product. They've lowered their cost, and then they're infusing them back into cannabis products. And so that's scary, and it's sort of kind of defeats the whole sort of value proposition that the regulated space has for consumers, where we've got the safer, naturally based product that's been well tested, that's well regulated. You should buy regulated cannabis and maybe pay a little extra for it. But if you kind of take away some of those value adds that drive consumers to the regulated cannabis market, you're sort of defeating that whole purpose. And so I think that's a big thing. And then one thing I didn't touch on, but and you ask where's the, and you can go to the next slide, what is causing that. You've got all of these, and we can skip to the next slide too. I don't want to take up too much of this presentation here, but under solutions, we talked about some of those solutions. You asked me about that, but I think one big one too is that sort of it's risk mitigation for the producers. At some point, as the regulators, finally kind of get around to addressing this problem, you're going to start to see recalls. And you also have, we've seen in California a bunch of class action lawsuits against some of these producers, where there's a kind of potential big financial hit they're going to take as consumers say, hey, you're lying to me about the THC content. You're bypassing some of these safeguards for contaminants, and now you're going to be legally liable for this. And so as these producers start to see recalls, as they start to get sued, the sort of the financial incentive to do some of this kind of stuff goes away, and now you're sort of taking a financial hit by doing that. And also potentially as we see that we're starting to see different programs pop up to try and give consumers extra confidence that maybe the regulations aren't doing all on their own. We're participating in a program called Trust and Testing, where we're trying to develop a more stringent kind of certification for laboratories, and so potentially that's a solution too, is some of these trust marks where consumers can say, hey, if it has this label, I know the laboratory's gone through some extra diligence, has extra safeguards in place, and that kind of thing. So that's also a solution. And then also at the end of the day, reducing some of the burden on the regulated market, doing away with some of the overly burdensome regulations, maybe reducing taxes at the consumer level, so that way we're not sort of putting the legal markets at a great competitive disadvantage to some of the illicit markets, or some of the hemp stuff that's not necessarily in keeping with sort of the intent of legalized hemp. I think those are all big things as far as solutions go, but a lot of this other stuff that's on these slides we've already touched on. And that's about it. There you go.
Casey and Jen.
All right. So some of this Andrew kind of touched on a little bit before, but what we're going to kind of talk about, and this is just going to be a high level overview. We couldn't possibly, go into as much detail as we want to, but some of the regulatory trends and enforcement and where we're seeing that stem from. Sampling, as Andrew noted, is, quite literally where this all begins. And what we see in different states is there are some states where the licensee is responsible for actually pulling the sample themselves. And where enforcement and the regulatory compliance part begins is in how those protocols are actually effectuated by the licensee and how they are able to comply with the requirements in actually pulling that sample. When is it pulled? How much is pulled? How is it contained? How is it stored before the lab comes and gets it? Who comes and gets it, right? Is the licensee transporting it? Is the lab transporting it? All of these different interplays that come in when you are in a market where the licensee is actually pulling the sample. There's states like New York where they create an entire license type around like a lab sampling firm. Now, a lab can also have that license where a part of their license, they are able to go actually pull the samples as well. But there's, you know, of the 12 lab sampling firms, only 6 right now are actually labs as well. And then you reach other states where the lab comes and actually pulls the sample. And within that, there's also different variations where the sample is put into a jar that is provided by the licensee, or sometimes it is actually pulled and sampled in the packaging that will eventually reach the consumer. When the sample is taken, right, there's finished product testing. You know, probably more common than not is that the finished product is actually what's tested. There are other states where it is tested throughout. You know, the flower might be tested for pesticides, oil has a different set of analytes, then the finished product gets tested. And then that also leads into what is a representative sample. From a regulatory enforcement side, that changes so much across the nation and across different markets. You know, a representative sample depends on the batch size. And in states where there are no batch size limits, it can become it's very different, right? As Andrew had mentioned, it's based solely on the production size. And in other states like newer markets in New Jersey and New York, what we're seeing is based on the total amount that's produced in a batch, there's a certain amount of sample increments that are actually taken or units that are sent for sampling. So kind of drilling down on that as new markets develop. And Jen, do you want to talk about the Colorado RTA?
Yeah, especially since Andrew mentioned this kind of reduced testing allowance. Historically in Colorado, this had been called process validation, later called reduced testing allowance, which does not require that every batch be submitted for testing so long as very specific parameters were met. But because of recent issues with testing fails and out of concern for public health and safety, the Science and Policy Work Group has been having very detailed conversations with the Colorado Marijuana Enforcement Division. And the final proposed rule revisions for the Marijuana Enforcement Division that were just released last week revise the ways that the licensee can achieve reduced testing allowance for microbial contaminants. It does require a hazard analysis and critical control point system to be implemented, which is something that Josh had also kind of mentioned. The Colorado rules are referencing ASTM standard on HACCP, which I think is fantastic and a great tool for licensees to be leveraging in their operations. The MED has also proposed an internal audit for cultivation facilities in order to assess their compliance with the MED requirements and achieving that privilege of RTA. Licensees are going to have to attest to compliance. I'm not going to dive too much into these. These are red line rules. I expect these rules to be adopted as is, but obviously it's an evolving circumstance. And if anyone has questions, comments, concerns, I'm also happy to talk offline in detail about those Colorado requirements. In the interest of time, let's also dive into some of the stability testing for right now as a very fast overview, since this is also evolving for many cannabis operators, depending on the state that they are in. At its simplest, what stability testing is that a batch or a portion of the batch is stored in accordance with storage conditions for that product and then retested at a later date. So if a portion of the batch that passes testing after being stored for 3 months could be determined to have an expiration date of 3 months, and then subsequently for 6, 9, 12 months from the date of production. Failing tests typically indicate that the product's expiration date should be equal to or less than the interval that it was stored for. Josh, definitely chime in if I botched any of that. But at a high level, it's up to the manufacturer to determine the appropriate type of test, number of tests, aging periods, and the storage conditions for their product. Casey, I know you've got kind of an overview on some of these states that are requiring stability testing, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, in some states, they don't even require stability testing. In Massachusetts, for example, there's not, a stability testing program yet. What happens is essentially the certificate of analysis expires after 12 months. And the way that is like, it's not really stability testing at all, but you can actually extend the expiration by getting it retested. And then that retest will actually count for another 12 months. New York right now doesn't contemplate any stability testing, but licensees are required to retain a representative sample that has to be stored on site and for future testing. New Jersey actually does have a stability testing program, where when the lab comes in and takes a sample, they'll also take another sample for stability testing, lock it up, keep it in the vault under the conditions that, the label says for proper storage, and we'll come back at 6 and 12 months to conduct that stability testing.
I guess with that, just to touch on Colorado again briefly, the Marijuana Enforcement Division has clearly indicated that the purpose of stability testing is to determine how long a product will stay within the product quality and safety standards while considering a variety of factors like temperature, humidity, light, packaging, etc. There are specific parameters where stability testing is required in MED rule. They vary based on products. So effective January 1st, 2024, products with the intended use of inhaled product have to include a use by date, and whether or not you've engaged in stability testing can impact that date. So also happy to answer questions about that offline, and expect we'll see more in the future there in Colorado as well as in other states. Another trend that I think we should definitely touch on for regulatory trends as well as enforcement is the use of decontamination, remediation, or as Colorado will now call it, microbial control steps. Again, at a very high level, we are seeing this trend evolve in various states where we work with licensees, and in several states where Casey and I audit facilities, we've seen our licensees implement decontamination tools in different parts of their cultivation, everything from, simply running O2 machines throughout your grow to using ozone machines on complete batches before testing, or even as a remediation effort post-testing. I think what I want to mention, because we've touched on the sample selection process pretty heavily here, as a compliance note, no matter what state you're in, it is important to ensure that if you are leveraging a decontamination procedure, that your whole batch is decontaminated and not just your representative sample, or your sample is not representative of your full batch. So I'll kind of leave it at that. Casey, do you have more on regulatory enforcement or some other trends that you've seen?
Yeah, I'll just do really quickly so we can get into hemp testing as well. Enforcement action it's no stranger to labs, and there's also enforcement related to, inaccurate reports of THC since as early as, 2018, 2019, allegations of, misreporting, inflating THC, again, all associated with large fines and enforcement action, suspending licenses, et cetera. But one important thing with these, with enforcement action as it relates to regulatory compliance is for labs, as Charlie had mentioned before, you are a cannabis licensee or a marijuana establishment, depending on the market, and you are held to the same standards in things like record keeping, security, and inventory tracking, waste disposal. We see a trend that even, on top of maybe inflated THC or misreporting, a lot of these allegations also include basic violations of regulatory requirements for all cannabis licenses. So not losing track of those type of regulatory requirements is so important for a lab, because as much as it's so important of what you're doing, you could also take some serious hits on your license for things like not disposing properly, again, not inventory tracking, and basic, record keeping and training and things that we know you're doing. It's just simply documenting them. And we've really seen an uptick in really coupling your enforcement and, boosting those fines based on non-compliance with that type of regulatory requirement.
Thanks, Casey. And I'm gonna push on ahead to hemp now. with Michelle, and then maybe we have time for a few questions at the end. But this is pretty big kind of issue going on in addition to potency is intoxicating hemp in the regulated industry.
All right, I think I got 5 minutes to leave time for questions, so see how quickly I could do it. So with all things innovation in this industry, typically the industry innovates before regulations and regulators can catch up with the products that are on the market. And kind of historically over the past few years, we've seen a trend on the hemp side of things of new and novel cannabinoids, some of which are intoxicating. I'd say that the cannabinoid du jour a couple of years ago was Delta 8. There was an explosion of that product and that ingredient across the country, and kind of currently moving in hemp land into Delta 9, but still a lot of the other cannabinoids, THCA, THCO, are still out there and on the market. Something to be aware of lab capabilities, and as you buy and purchase products, either as a consumer or as a retailer, making sure you're looking at those full panel COAs to see the type of cannabinoids that are being tested for, what they drill down to. Not every state has limits beyond total THC, which should encapsulate all the different fun cannabinoids, but you want to keep track of things. And then briefly touch on Missouri. Not sure those who've been following the drama out of Missouri, but the ability to utilize hemp and hemp ingredients in marijuana products varies state to state. Some states are silent, some states expressly allow it. And Missouri dealing with extremely large recall. I'd have to think it's one of the bigger ones we've seen to date, of about 45,000 products being recalled that had been sold that use some hemp cannabinoids, some hemp ingredients in those products. Actually, I think as of today, they said they're allowing about 15,000 of those products to be sold because they proved the ingredients were actually marijuana THC and not hemp THC. But having button-up documentation of your supply chain, what you're testing, what the ingredients are. Should any state regulator come knocking on the door and try to ask what your ingredients are, you want to make sure you have the paperwork so you're not looking at a license suspension, a revocation, and a massive recall of all your products. A lot more I can get into there, but just Google Missouri hemp and recall, and you'd have a fun evening for reading. Next slide. All right, then other things to note in hempland, as I like to call it. So every 5 years, we have a farm bill, tells us what to do, how to do for all things agriculture, and then a small component of that does deal with hemp. For those who recall, the 2018 Farm Bill actually required any laboratory who would be testing hemp to also be DEA registered. Kind of as a collective, the entire industry, both hemp consumer, producer, and laboratory, revolted in this requirement, given the onerous requirements that I'm sure Josh could speak to in a lot more detail that it takes to go and get a DEA registered lab. It's time consuming, it's costly, and there's some prohibitions if you also want to test state legal marijuana. So since 2018, USDA's issued, in conjunction with DEA, a delayed enforcement date, meaning you were supposed to be DEA registered in order to test any hemp, but they keep delaying it. So the latest delay does expire on December 31st, 2023. USDA has been lobbying down in Washington to get this to be permanently removed from the federal requirements. 5 years proof of concept, nothing's gone wrong being able to test hemp even outside DEA registered labs. But until that officially gets removed from federal law, it is still a requirement. And obviously that means we all have about 2 months to get labs DEA registered. I do anticipate USDA will be issuing an additional delay of enforcement, but something to keep an eye on as we negotiate the Farm Bill, which likely looks like it's going to come out in Q1 of next year, seeing whether or not that's permanently removed or whether DEA is successful again in including this language in the federal Farm Bill. I'm going to skip over THCA in the interest of time, but I have many things to say on that. Tune in for future webinars on the topic. And then just something to be aware of, on the hemp side, given what is going on with the intoxicating hemps and more states taking on regulation of finished hemp product, given FDA's hands-off approach at the moment, that a lot of states are getting much more detailed in the types of testing they want to see, much similar to marijuana. Some states still limited just to cannabinoid content, but the increasing trend of requiring heavy metals, pesticides, mycotoxins, really just treating this, as one plant, and acknowledging they want to test everything and understand what's going into these products. Oops, sorry, just had to pop up and can't read. And then something to be aware of, as states expand and start doing a lot more finished product, Minnesota is an example to pick on. Not all labs are as equipped as others with the capabilities to do both biomass testing, so the plant material, as well as finished product testing. So make sure you do your due diligence on the lab to make sure you understand, their capabilities, and make sure they can handle everything you're looking for, because consumers on the hemp side are getting way more sophisticated and certainly are pushing back. And especially as more distributors and retailers, wholesalers, in Minnesota, for example, the liquor stores, just saw Total Wine just launched their first end cap of all things hemp THC at Total Wine in Minnesota. So as the level of buyers of these products are becoming national chains and more sophisticated, they are looking for a lot more consistency in their COAs and doing a lot deeper due diligence. So definitely as the brand and the consumer spending more time yourself doing that due diligence as well. All right, I think I did it in 5 minutes. I have more to say though, but come back another time.
Thanks, Michelle. So I guess we probably don't have time for questions. So just email us any questions you have, and we'll do our best to get back to you. So just lastly here, I mean, this kind of goes psychedelic testing. This kind of goes to what Josh was saying earlier, which is that there are people that are going to get their products tested before they're legally required to have their products tested. And also the two psychedelic state license regimes that currently exist. One actually, is in process in Oregon, and the other one, Colorado. We're still waiting for rules and then licensure, but they will have a lab testing component. So this is just some notes on the Oregon psilocybin laboratory licenses. Apparently they're currently 2 licenses according to the website. These Oregon licenses do have a 50% residency requirement. Next slide. Yeah, so Colorado will also have a testing license, but we don't have the rules yet. Those are being developed, and then the rules regarding testing standards are also in process in Colorado. Next slide. Yeah, so the decriminalized market, which, frankly, is the largest psychedelic market right now. I mean, it's not necessarily easy to get information on this market, but we do know testing is occurring. At least one, psychedelic cup we're aware of, listed its testing partner on its website. So there's some physical evidence out there that people are testing, but this is, again, there are no regulatory requirements here. And I think that would be the last slide. So, in the 3 minutes here, see if I can find a good, easy, short question.
While you're doing that, because I just say one thing on the hemp. So we do we test for synthetic cannabinoids. We have a synthetic cannabinoid test, and just so people know, with some of these synthesized intoxicating cannabinoids you're seeing in hemp, what we do see also, besides the cannabinoid, oftentimes they have no idea what synthetic cannabinoid they've created. So it's labeled as Delta 8, but it's HHC or it's THCO acetate. But then you also see dozens, literally, of other unknown products that come from that synthetic process. And we haven't, we've identified some of them, but we haven't identified all of them. And I know the producers have no clue what they are. And so, what the long-term effects are of those, with the, acute toxicity of them is, but also what the chronic toxicity of some of those compounds is, it's completely unknown. So you're sort of, the consumer is sort of the lab rat here. And then with some of these states requiring testing of these products, that's a great step in the right direction, but they also have to have enforcement of those testing requirements, which we're not seeing in most places. You can send your testing. The nice thing about hemp is, if I'm a producer in Wisconsin and I don't have any cannabis testing labs, you can send your product across state lines to a testing lab, and that has the wherewithal to do some of this testing. I encourage it. And then with psychedelic testing, I really worry that with psychedelics, we'll see the same thing where the potency or the strength of the psychedelic sort of becomes its selling point. And you know, with cannabis, that's one thing. With psychedelics, that's just scary to me. You know, it'll kill that industry before it even gets off the ground if that's where we're going to go, with, you know, with consumers and with these cups too. I think they all need to make sure that that's sort of not how they're judging the entries there is on strength.
All right. Well, thanks, Josh. Thanks for raising those points. Here's everyone's emails. You know, obviously we didn't get to questions, but thanks everyone for joining. And yeah, we'll send around the slides and the YouTube clip once it's, I mean, the full video once it's ready. So thanks everyone. I hope you found this as informative as I did.